Hey, Lauren, we have a special guest today.
Yes, it's very exciting.
So we're thrilled to welcome Ryan Murray to the podcast. Ryan is ASN's Senior Manager at Policy and Government Affairs and spends a lot of time thinking about the research enterprise, particularly the federal government's role in kidney research. So, Ryan, welcome.
Thank you. Great to be here with you.
So Lauren and I thought we would start off by just a quick update on FY26. So the current federal fiscal year ends at the end of September, and so Congress needs to appropriate funding for all of the federal agencies, and the president then has to sign or approve that funding. And that's unlikely to happen. So we're in the situation where they need to do something in a short term. So what's your best sense as to, just at a big picture, how that's going to play out?
Yeah, we're certainly coming down to the wire, with September 30th being the end of the current fiscal year, particularly when you count in recess days that Congress has in their calendar. But the House just recently passed a short-term Republican-backed spending bill that would keep the government funded until November 21st and effectively avert a shutdown. However, that bill is now being sent to the Senate, where we anticipate that it will face a significant challenge from Democrats that have signaled so far strong opposition. So certainly a wait and see kind of mode in Congress.
Great, thanks. And I think one important point here is part of the reason why the Democrats have some leverage is because I believe the Senate needs 60 votes to approve the stopgap funding, and as a result, they need help from I think maybe seven Democrats. Is my memory correct on that?
Yeah, no, you're absolutely right.
Okay, great. Thanks. So, as we think about federal support for medical research, most people think of the National Institutes of Health. So, we'll probably spend a lot of time there, but there are a lot of other federal agencies that fund kidney research. Where would you like to go now that we've talked about the next couple of months in terms of FY26? Where would you like to go in terms of other issues to discuss?
Yeah, I think it'd be helpful for our listeners to learn a little bit about where Congress is focusing on in terms of medical research, both with the standard appropriations package, as well as a couple policy levers that are currently being pulled by both the administration and Congress.
Okay. I'm curious as to where you'd like to go. So, it's all you.
Okay, fantastic. Well, I don't think I'm really breaking any news here to our listeners that this administration has had its sights on the National Institutes of Health and the research institutions that rely on federal funding for quite a while now. You really just have to look back at the president's proposed budget, which called for the NIH to receive $27.5 billion for the upcoming fiscal year, which is about 40% below its current funding level of 48 billion. However, thankfully, medical research and medical research funding really carries some favor in Congress still. As we were just kind of discussing, we're in the middle of appropriation season and possibly heading to a government shutdown. But the House, the package that it recently passed included a $47.8 billion for the NIH, so a slight cut from its current levels and definitely well short of what ASN has been advocating for, which was 51.3 billion, but also thankfully well above what the White House was requesting of 27.5 billion.
Yeah, and I guess as we sort of focus on the NIH, to me, there's kind of three or four issues. So one is, as you said, is the funding piece, and it does seem like there's bipartisan support to at least maintain current federal funding levels, which is good news given that the administration sort of started this discussion with a pretty dramatic cut. You mentioned that the administration had its sights set on institutions. So I think a next issue maybe to talk about quickly is just indirect costs. And so the administration really is trying to make those lower, but also more consistent across institutions. So what's happening on that front?
So since the White House hasn't found strong support for the goals in Congress when it comes to research funding, they've tried multiple levers, including indirect costs. They first proposed a 15% cap on facilities and administrative or indirect costs that are associated with award funding. Since then, there's been in multiple lawsuits that are currently working their way through the court. However, in order to really get ahead of this issue, a group of national organizations formed the Joint Associations Group on Indirect Cost, or JAG, and has proposed the Financial Accountability and Research, or FAIR model as an alternative. The granular details are still being worked out, but ASN thinks that this is a great first step in increasing transparency and aligning reimbursement with actual project needs, And thankfully, we've seen this new model, or at least the JAG itself, receive bipartisan support in both the House and Senate, with bill or report language included in a number of the FY 2026 spending bills, acknowledging their work, asking for the White House to really work with the community in any type of facility administrative cost reform.
Great, thanks. So we've talked a little bit about funding. We've talked a little bit about indirect costs, which is more of sort of an institutional issue. At the same time, the fact that the institutions have banded together, have come forward with a counter proposal, seems like there's some room for optimism there. I guess the area that's probably getting the most attention is one that I think I'm personally most concerned about is the upfront funding. Can you help us understand exactly what that means and its potential impacts on the kidney research funding moving forward?
Yeah, absolutely. So this is another policy lever that's being used by the White House, in which they most recently announced upfront funding policy that requires 50% of competing grant awards for the remainder of this fiscal year to be fully funded upfront, as opposed to receiving funding across multiple years. Now, the good news is that this policy only applies to new awards and not to non-competitive renewals or clinical trials, but it obviously drastically increases the immediate cost of each new award so that the NIH, which is constrained by its funding levels that were appropriated months before this policy was implemented, can only fund fewer grants overall, denying even those grants with very highly competitive scores.
I'm just trying to make sure I understand this. So basically what's happening is it's likely the NIH will be sort of flat funded. It's likely indirect costs will probably be less in a lot of institutions, but there'll be some variability there, but probably lower than they've been historically. And then with the upfront funding, it'll make it so that there's less of money available in the future to fund new research. Is that sort of, I'm just trying to get a sense as to the situation.
Yes, you're absolutely correct. Essentially, with the upfront policy piece, the funding, as you mentioned, will probably, for the NIH, will probably stay relatively flat. However, that pool will, with each new award being larger, the pool will have less recipients for the funding to go around.
Got it. Thanks. So one of the things too is I know NIH has sort of shifted its terminology away from pay lines, but because of how this is being applied, there's going to be real variability within institutes and centers, but also, between and among them. And so I think one of the challenges is just a sort of communications challenge and just sort of understanding the data and the impact and things. So any suggestions as people are trying to understand the implications here? I mean, obviously, this is something we're not supportive of. At the same time, to sort of think about all these different threats to research funding, the first goal is to try to protect the funding at levels, similar to where they've been in the past. The second is probably to try to address this issue around upfront funding, and then the third would be the indirect costs, again, recognizing that's more of an institutional level. I'm just trying to balance all these different pieces before I get to my fourth question.
Yeah, I mean, we're hearing directly from our members how this is likely going to impact them, these two policies. We're hearing estimates that the pay line may fall from the 12th percentile to somewhere between 5th and 9th percentile, effectively reducing the number of funded studies by 25 to as high as 60%. So obviously, this is upfront funding requirement is a huge priority of ASN to hopefully reverse. And we've written to the NIH Director Bhattacharya to express our strong opposition to the implemented policy, warning how, again, the change could undermine the stability of kidney research funding, disproportionately harm early career investigators, and reduce accountability in the grant process by providing all of the funding up front. So, in addition to reaching out directly to the NIH director, we've also raised the policy this month when submitting an official statement for the record for the Senate Finance Committee hearing on the President's 2026 healthcare agenda, urging Congress, to really support critical funding for scientific research. So ASN is trying to tackle this issue on two fronts, both in front of Congress and directly with the administration.
Yeah, Ryan, I'm glad you mentioned the statement for the record for the recent Senate Finance Committee on the administration's healthcare agenda. Lauren, I know you worked hard on our statement. And I'm just wondering if you could describe, in addition to this issue around NIH funding and the potential implications of upfront funding, the other issues that we raised in our statement.
So, in addition to calling on Congress to sustain critical funding for scientific research, like you mentioned, the letter also urged Congress to preserve confidence in and access to vaccines. And the last issue we addressed was related to data integrity and transparency. And for this one, we urged Congress to strengthen data transparency and integrity. And we also use this as an opportunity to express opposition and concern with the Centers for Medicare and Medicaid Services decision to remove race and ethnicity questions from Form CMS 2728.
So Ryan, I'm going to come back to you. Before we move sort of off NIH, I just wanted to ask about reorganization, because I know that's another piece. Is there's been a lot of interest among the administration and members of Congress, really on both sides of the aisle, about perhaps sort of organizing NIH differently. Is there any update on that?
Yeah, so both the Senate and the House have included reorganization in their report language. This is something that ASN has been on the record of opposing, only because as of now, the administration really has presented the reorganization and really going it alone as opposed to weighing in with community input.
Great, thanks. Yeah, and I should say for our listeners, so within the appropriations process, there's the actual funding level. So the authorizing committee. So again, we'll use the Senate as an example. In the Senate, you have the Senate Finance Committee and the Senate Help Committee, and they'll have jurisdiction over most healthcare related issues, and they'll set sort of funding sort of guidelines, if you will. But then for discretionary funding, like the National Institutes of Health that are on the fiscal year, the appropriating committees have to come in within sort of those guidelines. They don't have authorization. So what they'll do is if there's something from a policy perspective they want to raise, they'll do it through report language that accompanies their appropriations bill. So that's probably a gross oversimplification, but it just gives you a sense of the dialogue between the administration, which will use its budget and sort of its mechanisms to, and particularly propose rules on the entitlement side to make points about things, and then how Congress and different committees will make their points. And there's a little bit of this back and forth discussion, as we've talked a lot about on this podcast. We then, when we respond to proposed rules, we're then adding to the conversation as well as our other members of the kidney community. So it is sort of an interesting process of what happens kind of in the public. And then, of course, there's everything behind the scenes in terms of advocacy, meeting with members of Congress, meeting with congressional staff, meeting with administration folks and people in the regulatory agencies like CMS. Before we move off NIH, I'm just curious about other research agencies. I know the Agency for Healthcare Research and Quality was zeroed out by the administration. Wondering if you have an update there. And then any other sort of research, kidney research funding points you want to make before we move to the campaign that we're excited about.
All that I would say is that the appropriations process is still playing itself out. So while ARC is currently zeroed out, there is still time for advocates, ASN members, and members of the research community to have their voices heard by Congress to hopefully show their support and have ARC kind of come back to life. In addition to ARC, obviously HHS took some big cuts across all of its underlying agencies, the NIH, the FDA, CMS, CDC, et cetera. So I think it's important for Congress to hear from its constituents and would encourage our listeners to definitely make their voices heard.
Great, thanks. So let's finish with a campaign and a community-wide effort beyond the nephrology community, the entire sort of research community. And I know, Ryan, you've spent a lot of time on this and you're one of the key participants in it. So I look forward to you describing it to us. And Lauren and I are then going to follow up with one question each. So Lauren, I'll go first and then you'll get the last word in terms of a question to Ryan about the campaign. So Ryan?
Yes, thanks, Todd. While Congress does still generally favor funding for medical and scientific research, a little message reinforcement never hurts. So, ASN has partnered with Research America and other national organizations to launch an advocacy campaign this fall that we're really excited to share. The campaign itself is titled Americans for Medical Research. It's a fairly traditional advocacy strategy that employs both paid and earned media aimed at activating key voting constituencies in four targeted states, urging those voters to contact their congressional delegation in support of federally funded research. The four states are Pennsylvania, North Carolina, Kansas, and Utah. And they were chosen given the reliance of each state's large research ecosystem on federal funding and the unique ability for their members in Congress, particularly in the Senate, to likely have a greater direct impact on the appropriations process.
So my question's a little less about the campaign and more about ASN Kidney Week because it's taking place in Houston, Texas, and obviously Texas is a state with a large research infrastructure. So, as we're preparing for Kidney Week, what are the sessions or what are some of the things you're thinking about in terms of raising awareness about the effect of kidney research on care for the 37 million Americans living with kidney disease?
So there's a couple of sessions that I did want to highlight at Kidney Week that revolve around policy, advocacy, or healthcare justice. The first taking place on Thursday, November 6th, titled 2 Years of Change, the United States, Congress, the White House, the Policies Impacting Kidney Care for Private Practice and Academia Alike. It'll give a very succinct summary of what's been taking place over the past 2 years as we've kind of transitioned from the Biden to the Trump administration. There's obviously a couple of other activities throughout Kidney Week that we will be highlighting, again, that revolve around the themes of policy, advocacy, and healthcare justice. If you can learn more by visiting the policy website, the Kidney Health Advocacy Timeline on the ASN website, as well as the Policy ASN Insider newsletter, the monthly newsletter that goes out the third Monday of every month, in which we will be listing all of our policy related activities at Kidney Week.
Great. Thanks, Ryan. Lauren, you get the last question.
Oh, perfect. Thank you. So, Ryan, you mentioned that this campaign currently has a focus on four states. Can you elaborate more on how ASM members from these states can get involved, as well as maybe members from other states as well?
Yeah, thanks, Lauren. So I would encourage our listeners to visit americansformedicalresearch.org, the title of the campaign, to learn more, share their stories, which could end up being selected to be included in the campaign. So if our listeners, their colleagues, or someone they know that they might have trained with during as fellows are again from either Pennsylvania, North Carolina, Kansas, or Utah, and are interested in sharing their story about being impacted by NIH funding cuts or the general budget uncertainty, or how their research illustrates why federal funding for medical and health research is crucial. I encourage them again to just visit americansformedicalresearch.org. If our listeners are not from those four states but still want to support the campaign's efforts, not to worry. There will still be an opportunity for them to lend their voices and support in the future. The campaign's website will be updated so individuals across the country will be able to contact their congressional delegation directly. Very similar to the ASN's Legislative Action Center, which also deserves its own plug. But for now, we're targeting these four states and just encourage everyone else to continue to stay informed. We obviously on staff will be sure to share more information about the campaign as it progresses across ASN's various communication channels.
Great. Well, thanks, Ryan. Appreciate your joining us. And Lauren, thanks for all your help as well. And look forward to continuing the conversation and making sure that we continue to support kidney research.
Thank you.
This podcast is copyrighted by the American Society of Nephrology. All rights reserved. All content in this podcast is for informational purposes only and is not intended to be medical advice. This podcast should not be used in a medical emergency or for the diagnosis or treatment of any medical condition. Please consult your doctor or other qualified healthcare professional if you have any questions about any medical condition or before taking any drug, changing your diet, or commencing or discontinuing any course of treatment. Thank you for listening to this podcast from the American Society of Nephrology.